So here we go, the history of gravitation, part two. So we had discussed the ancient world and the Greeks. Now moving on to the Dark Ages. So Dark Ages, we're talking like after the fall of the Roman Empire through to about 1400 AD in Europe. So why for Europe, by the way? Because it's actually in this time span that both the Chinese culture as well as the Arabic culture undergo a golden age. And this was actually some of their greatest days of invention and understanding mathematics and medicine and architecture and etc. But we're once again focusing on the Western world in terms of this story. So the Dark Ages, people think, oh, there was no understanding, no scientific advancement in the Dark Ages. That's not really true exactly. There were some specific areas where there was advancement. We'll talk about those in a second. But why was there such a lack of scientific advancement, and as well as a lot of cultural advancement during this time period? Well, in a lot of ways, I would say it's partially because of our astronomy story, right? What power comes to the fore at the end of the Roman Empire, and that would of course be the Roman Catholic Church. And the Roman Catholic Church adopts the geocentric model. Why would they adopt the geocentric model? Well, very simply, if you think about the geocentric model, it puts the Earth at the center of civilization, not just civilization, it puts the Earth at the center of the universe. And it's this idea that we are God's one special creation. So a geocentric model which centers existence upon the Earth is a very compelling narrative notion in order for adoption. And we have to understand some other things about the Catholic Church as well as society at the time. So you may know this pyramid as a structure called a hierarchy, right? Where people with low power on the bottom, fewer people with greater power until you get to the top there, people with the most power. This is the same structure as the feudal system. And a lot of Europe is functionally adopting that feudal system, where the people at the bottom were tied to the land, right? Like if you were a serf or a peasant, you were owned by the Lord and you couldn't leave. This lack of free flow between physical places, in a lot of ways, stunts knowledge growth, right? One thing that really spurs knowledge growth is communication and having your beliefs challenged. It's hard to challenge beliefs if you don't physically encounter people with different beliefs. And so the lack of travel in those days, because of the structure, probably did a lot in order to quell scientific knowledge. There's other reasons as well. So the Roman Catholic Church adopts this same sort of hierarchical model. And that becomes super important because the Pope is seen as God's representative on earth, literally the voice of God at earth. And so marry that with the geocentric model. If the Pope is the top of the Roman Catholic Church, and the Church has said that Earth is the center of God's existence, and they're positing that the Church is also the center of human existence, that literally puts the Pope in this very specific, special place in the eyes of God, right? That's a very powerful political notion to say that all political power comes from God as the center of existence, whereas special creation and the Pope is the center of that, right? That's the divine right of rulers that you heard about when you were studying Western history. To challenge that is to challenge their power structure. So challenging the power structure is going to get you killed. And because the geocentric model locates and verifies these people as the center of existence, to challenge the geocentric model is to challenge the church. And in that time period, if you did that, you were persecuted and killed. Okay? And there are legions of people in this time period that were persecuted and killed for their beliefs about science, because those scientific beliefs intersected the political reality that manifested and got tied to them. I'm not saying that's anything good or bad about religion. I'm talking about the politics of the time and how science got politically mixed up with religion. Now, like I said, there were quite a number of scientific advancements, though, during what is "quote unquote" the Dark Ages. You may notice this is a picture of Notre Dame Cathedral before it burned down. They're restoring it now, but there were great advancements in architecture during this time period, specifically to create monuments to God. Right, the great cathedrals of Western Europe that were built over the course of hundreds of years were a monument to scientific advancement in architecture, as well as masonry work and whatnot. And that was done from a religious impulse. You also know warfare was a big thing during the feudal ages. Our knowledge of things like ballistics and projectile motion, because we wanted to kill people more effectively, our Visigoths and whatnot. But that was also happening on the Western side. Our knowledge also of metals, in order to forge better armor and weaponry, advanced dramatically during this time period. So it's not that the Dark Ages there was no scientific advancement. It's just that the advancement was more to advance political power through warfare, or political power through architecture to glory God. Now, fast forward to the Renaissance. So we're talking 15th century AD and beyond. So why does the Renaissance actually happen? Well, there's a lot of political rumblings, and I'm not going to get into all of that. But one thing that does happen at the end of the Dark Ages are the Crusades. And so you'll know that those were holy missions, quote unquote, where the Pope says, let's go reclaim Jerusalem and the Holy Land from the heathens. And that's at least the way that was phrased. Super unfortunate. But the Westerners went and they absolutely wreaked havoc in the Middle East in terms of ripping down culture and killing, and it was really bad. We're not going to talk about that. But the reason why I bring it up is because during the Dark Ages, a lot of culture was lost. A lot of the Greek tradition was quelled or suppressed, and people didn't learn it because they didn't have access to it. They didn't know it anymore. The Crusades bring back to Europe two very important things. The first thing is they bring back all the Greek knowledge. They went and ransacked all these places in the Arab world, which were the same places that Alexander put his libraries and stored that knowledge. So we went to the Crusades and ironically brought back the knowledge that was quashed after the Greek Empire fell. So it was like a reclamation almost of Western tradition, but like 1,200 years later. So we brought that back. And we also brought back the plague. So that was not so good. But both of those things actually spur a lot of ideas with the Renaissance. And I think, how could the plague do that? Well, the plague, because it was so deadly and killed off so many people, a lot of power structures were weakened. It was seen that, God couldn't help us as well. And people started questioning Catholic Church, questioning people who are supposed to be protecting them, questioning the structures that were holding things in place. And that was an important thing that allowed the Renaissance to flourish in a lot of ways. And the other thing is it brought back all this Greek learning. So there's all this information that we had lost. So I want to go through some of the traditions of the Renaissance, but talk about why, ironically, war, the Crusades, kind of spurred on this portion of history. So this was come up one at a time, but here we go. So the traditions of the Renaissance. Humanism. This is just the very simple notion that human beings matter, like that your individual life matters. In the feudal structure, individual life literally doesn't matter. So that was a new notion that was brought up and believed and explored during the Renaissance. The next is rationalism. That goes back to Thales, that it's not God acting in our world that caused things to happen, but that there's just a specific cause and effect of physical phenomena, and that we can find a reason for things that isn't located in divine intervention, right? So rationalism, super important. Empiricism. Oh my God, we require evidence. evidence that's grounded in the physical world. That's all empirical means. Empirical evidence is physical evidence from the real world. And the last is a notion called Occam's razor. Occam's razor, very simple. It says that given two solutions to a problem, the simplest is probably true. Very powerful notion when trying to figure out things about the world. And these are some of the intellectual traditions of the Renaissance. So the first person that we're going to talk about in this is Copernicus. So Copernicus is known as the father of modern heliocentrism. Now, we know for a fact that this is not the first heliocentric model. In fact, in this book that Copernicus ends up writing on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres, he does cite the work by Archimedes that cites the work by Aristarchus. So we know there's a direct line between that knowledge that was brought back from the Crusades and Copernicus's work. Now, Copernicus, a little bit about him. People are like, oh, he must have been revolutionary, overthrowing these paradigms to come up with this heliocentric model. And actually, nothing could be further from the truth. Copernicus actually was a member of the church himself. He was an ordained deacon, so he's a member of the clergy. In fact, he's actually the nephew of the Pope. So he has a very close ties to the Roman Catholic Church. But he's also a scientist. Ironically enough, it's the church that trains him, sends him to university to become a scientist, specifically an astronomer. And at that time, the calendar that the church was using was slightly flawed. It was using the Ptolemaic model in order to make predictions. Now, a lot of Roman Catholic feast days occur in specific calendar dates, like on the second new moon, after the vernal equinox, etc. Right? So there's all these weird calendar things that determine when feast days are. So the Pope wants to have a calendar revision. And there was starting to become these small problems with the Ptolemaic model that was making it a little bit more difficult to do certain predictions, like when eclipses were happening. Things were a little bit off from the Ptolemaic model. So the Pope at the time says to Copernicus, why don't you do a calendar revision for us? And there you go. And so this book ends up being the result of that. So the total irony of it. Anyway, Copernicus worked on this book for 20 years. So he takes all the data at the time, and he's doing all the data out, and obviously he's reading the Greeks as well. And he does all the work and comes to a conclusion and then throws it out. He does the work again, just double checking, doing his work, and throws it out. In fact, he does the work about 20 separate times and throws out the work. And we know this because of his work journals that we still have access to. And it takes him 20 times to go through the work before he convinces himself the model he's come up with is the correct model. And the reason why it takes him so long is because the model he comes up with each time is this heliocentric model, right? He's not attempting to overthrow any systems. In fact, it was very hard for him to make the intellectual leap to say, this is what's happening. So what helps him make the leap? Well, very simply, it was that notion of Occam's razor that I talked about before. When he came up with this, in fact, in the foreword of the book, Copernicus dedicates this book to the Pope and says something to the effect of that the reason why Ptolemy's system is wrong is that, quote, God's design would never be so clumsy, right? That epicycloid model just so convoluted, whereas this system makes the same exact predictions as the Ptolemaic system without any sort of clunky models. So let's go through what the model that Copernicus comes up with is. So first, he says that the sun is at the center of the universe. There it is, heliocentrism. Second, that all the planets orbit the sun in perfect circles at constant speeds. So still holds on to that perfect circles at constant speeds notion, that Greek aesthetic rearing its head again. We're going to find out that that's still not that's not true, but it's still there in the model. Next, that the Earth rotates once per day on its tilted axis, and that's what causes us to see the sun move through the sky or the moon move through the sky in the way that it does. The way that the stars move is because of the rotation of the Earth, not because of their motion. And he says that the axis wobbles very slightly over very long periods of time. That's called the precession of the Earth. That's not really an important detail, but it is a detail of the model. And that next, the distance between the planets and the sun is very small compared to the distance between the sun and the other stars. That's why even though the other planets that we see as stars, they're not actually stars, they're planets, trying to verify that. Now, the way he explains the retrograde motion, if we go back for a second, if the Earth is going around in our orbit like this, right? If Mars is going slower, there are going to be times when it looks like as the Earth is moving and Mars is moving, that the Earth is moving forwards with respect to Mars. There's going to be times when it looks like when the Earth is like here and Mars is there, that it looks like we're approaching Mars. And so there are times when, based on where they are in their relative orbits, that cause that to have that perception of retrograde motion. So there it is, the elements of Copernican heliocentrism. Now, here's the thing. Copernicus was actually very nervous to publish because he knew it was going to cause shockwaves. In fact, Copernicus doesn't end up publishing his book until 1543. Oddly enough, he knows he's dying at the time. So he waits until that moment before looking to publish the book. So here's the thing. There are people before who have positive heliocentrism, but they got persecuted and the information didn't spread. So why did Copernican heliocentrism spread when other heliocentric models didn't spread? Well, there are three main reasons for that. These are supposed to come up one at a time, but here we go. Here they are. One, they made sense to people because they were grounded in the traditions of the Renaissance. There was a reason for everything, rationalism. Empiricism is all based on data that could be viewed in the book that he wrote. And humanism, it places the human being at the center of existence because no longer is the earth the center of existence. It sort of dislodges this notion that we are God's special creation some way. And if we're not God's special creation, then the human being must be an individual and an important thing. As we talked about, the Roman Catholic Church is waning in a power, but partially because of the Black Plague diminished their power. But also in this time period, the mid 1500s, you will note Martin Luther is up there in the Germanic countries, causing all sorts of problems, causing the Protestant Revolution. So you have the entire northern part of Europe that is breaking away from the Catholic Church, diminishing their power. But most important, as I said, that this book got published, and it got published on the printing press. And so there's a rapid dissemination of the information, well, rapid for that time period, dissemination of information that didn't exist with other information sources. So it's very hard to control information if the information is going out. The reason why the Catholic Church was able to maintain its power is because it was able to suppress information before it got out. In the same way that Aristotle was able to spread his information throughout the Arab world, because Copernicus is able to spread his information throughout throughout Europe, his ideas catch on in a very significant way before the Catholic Church can really catch on. And then I just one of my favorite memes here, right? So I would say that the invention of the printing press is the first punch. The second punch there would be Das Revolution of Us, which is the title of Copernicus's book. So Copernicus puts it out there. There it is. We've got this heliocentric model. So I'm going to stop here for another break, drink some water, and then we'll talk about how we get from the heliocentric model of Copernicus all the way through to our modern understanding of gravity.